Section 21 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 4. Chapter 5. Another fortnight had passed by. It was the beginning of January, and cold mists benumbed the immense plain. The misery had grown still greater, and the settlements were in agony from hour to hour beneath the increasing famine. 4,000 francs sent by the International from London had scarcely supplied bread for 3 days, and then nothing had come. This great dead hope was beating down their courage. On what were they to count now, since even their brothers had abandoned them? They felt themselves separated from the world, and lost in the midst of this deep winter. On Tuesday, no resources were left in the 240 settlement. Étienne and the delegates had multiplied their energies. New subscriptions were opened in the neighbouring towns, and even in Paris. Collections were made and lectures organized. These efforts came to nothing. Public opinion, which had at first been moved, grew indifferent now that the strike dragged on forever, and so quietly, without any dramatic incidents. Small charities scarcely sufficed to maintain the poorer families. The others lived by pawning their clothes and sewing up the household piece by piece. Everything went to the brokers: the wool of the mattresses, the kitchen utensils, even the furniture. For a moment they thought themselves saved, for the small retail shopkeepers of Montsou, killed out by Michaelides, had offered credit to try and get back their custom. And for a week Verdonck, the grocer, and the 2 bakers, Carolle and Smelten, kept open shop. But when their advances were exhausted, all 3 stopped. The bailiffs were rejoicing. There only resulted a piling up of debts which would for a long time weigh upon the miners. There was no more credit to be had anywhere, and not an old saucepan to sell. They might lie down in a corner to die like mangy dogs. Étienne would have sold his flesh. He had given up his salary and had gone to Martian's to pawn his trousers and cloth coat, happy to set the Maheu's pot boiling once more. His boots alone remained, and he retained these to keep a firm foothold, he said. His grief was that the strike had come on too early, before the Provident Fund had had time to swell. He regarded this as the only cause of the disaster, for the workers would surely triumph over the masters on the day when they had saved enough money to resist. And he recalled Souvarine words, accusing the Company of pushing forward the strike to destroy the fund at the beginning. The sight of the settlement and of these poor people without bread or fire overcame him. He preferred to go out and to weary himself with distant walks. One evening, as he was coming back and passing near Réquillart, he perceived an old woman who had fainted by the roadside. No doubt she was dying of hunger, and having raised her he began to shout to a girl whom he saw on the other side of the paling. "Why, is it you?" he said, recognizing Mouquette. "Come and help me, then. We must give her something to drink." Mouquette, moved to tears, quickly went into the shaky hovel which her father had set up in the midst of the ruins. She came back at once with gin and a loaf. The gin revived the old woman, who, without speaking, bit greedily into the bread. She was the mother of a miner who lived at a settlement on the Cougny side, and she had fallen there on returning from Joiselle, where she had in vain attempted to borrow half a franc from a sister. When she had eaten she went away dazed. Étienne stood in the open field of Réquillart, where the crumbling sheds were disappearing beneath the brambles. "Well, won't you come in and drink a little glass?" asked Mouquette merrily. And, as he hesitated, "Then you're still afraid of me?" He followed her, won by her laughter. This bread, which she had given so willingly, moved him. She would not take him into her father's room, but led him into her own room, where she at once poured out 2 little glasses of gin. The room was very neat, and he complimented her on it. Besides, the family seemed to want for nothing. The father continued his duties as a groom at the Voreux, while she, saying that she could not live with folded arms, had become a laundress, which brought her in 30 sous a day, One may amuse oneself with men, but one isn't lazy for all that." "I say," she murmured, all at once coming and putting her arms round him prettily, "why don't you like me?" He could not help laughing. She had done this in so charming a way. "But I like you very much," he replied. "No, no, not like I mean. You know that I am dying of longing. Come, it would give me so much pleasure." It was true, she had desired him for 6 months. He still looked at her as she clung to him, pressing him with her two tremulous arms, her face raised with such supplicating love that he was deeply moved. There was nothing beautiful in her large round face, with its yellow complexion eaten by the coal, but her eyes shone with flame, a charm rose from her skin, a trembling of desire which made her rosy and young. In face of this gift, which was so humble and so ardent, he no longer dared to refuse. "Oh, you are willing!" she stammered, delighted. "Oh, you are willing!" And she gave herself up with the fainting awkwardness of a virgin, as if it was for the first time, and she had never before known a man. Then, when he left her, it was she who was overcome with gratitude. She thanked him and kissed his hands. Étienne remained rather ashamed of this good fortune. Nobody boasted of having had Mouquette. As he went away he swore that it should not occur again, but he preserved a friendly remembrance of her. She was a capital girl. When he got back to the settlement he found serious news which made him forget the adventure. The rumour was circulating that the Company would, perhaps, agree to make a concession if the delegates made a fresh attempt with the manager. At all events, some captains had spread this rumour. The truth was that in this struggle the mine was suffering even more than the miners. On both sides obstinacy was piling up ruin. While labour was dying of hunger, capital was being destroyed. Every day of rest carried away hundreds of thousands of francs. Every machine which stops is a dead machine. Tools and material are impaired. The money that is sunk melts away like water drunk by the sand. Since the small stock of coal at the surface of the pits was exhausted, customers talked of going to Belgium, so that in future they would be threatened from that quarter. But what especially frightened the Company, although the matter was carefully concealed, was the increasing damage to the galleries and workings. The captains could not cope with the repairs, the timber was falling everywhere, and landslips were constantly taking place. Soon the disasters became so serious that long months would be needed for repairs before hewing could be resumed. Already stories were going about the country. At Crévecoeur 300 metres of road had subsided in a mass, stopping up access to the Sans Paume. At Madeleine the Maugrétout seam was crumbling away and filling with water. The management refused to admit this, but suddenly two accidents, one after the other, had forced them to avow it. One morning, near Piolaine, the ground was found cracked above the north gallery of Mirou, which had fallen in the day before; and on the following day the ground subsided within the Voreux, shaking a corner of a suburb to such an extent that two houses nearly disappeared. Étienne and the delegates hesitated to risk any steps without knowing the directors' intentions. Dansaert, whom they questioned, avoided replying. Certainly the misunderstanding was deplored, and everything would be done to bring about an agreement, but he could say nothing definitely. At last they decided that they would go to M. Hennebeau in order to have reason on their side, for they did not wish to be accused, later on, of having refused the Company an opportunity of acknowledging that it had been in the wrong. Only they vowed to yield nothing, and to maintain, in spite of everything, their terms, which were alone just. The interview took place on Tuesday morning, when the settlement was sinking into desperate wretchedness. It was less cordial than the first interview. Maheu was still the speaker, and he explained that their mates had sent them to ask if these gentlemen had anything new to say. At first M. Hennebeau affected surprise. No order had reached him, nothing could be changed so long as the miners persisted in their detestable rebellion. And this official stiffness produced the worst effects. so that if the delegates had gone out of their way to offer a conciliation, the way in which they were received would only have served to make them more obstinate. Afterwards, the manager tried to seek a basis of mutual concession. Thus, if the men would accept the separate payment for timbering, the Company would raise that payment by the 2 centimes which they were accused of profiting by. Besides, he added that he would take the offer on himself, that nothing was settled, but that he flattered himself he could obtain this concession from Paris. But the delegates refused, and repeated their demands: the retention of the old system, with a rise of 5 centimes a tram. Then he acknowledged that he could treat with them at once, and urged them to accept in the name of their wives and little ones dying of hunger. And with eyes on the ground and stiff heads, they said no, always no, with fierce vigour. They separated curtly. M. Hennebeau banged the doors. Étienne, Maheu, and the others went off stamping with their great heels on the pavement, in the mute rage of the vanquished pushed to extremes. Towards 2 o'clock the women of the settlement, on their side, made an application to Maigrat. There was only this hope left, to bend this man and to wrench from him another week's credit. The idea originated with Maheude, who often counted too much on people's good nature. She persuaded the Brulé and the Levaque to accompany her. As to Pierron, she excused herself, saying that she could not leave Pierron, whose illness still continued. Other women joined the band till they numbered quite 20. When the inhabitants of Montsou saw them arrive, gloomy and wretched, occupying the whole width of the road, they shook their heads anxiously. Doors were closed, and one lady hid her plate. It was the first time they had been seen thus, and there could not be a worse sign. Usually everything was going to ruin when the women thus took to the roads. At Maigrat there was a violent scene. At first he had made them go, jeering and pretending to believe that they had come to pay their debts. That was nice of them to have agreed to come and bring the money all at once. Then, as soon as Maheude began to speak, he pretended to be enraged. Were they making fun of people? More credit? Then they wanted to turn him into the street? No, not a single potato, not a single crumb of bread. And he told them to be off to the grocer Verdonck, and to the bakers Carolle and Smelton, since they now dealt with them. The women listened with timid humility, apologizing, and watching his eyes to see if he would relent. He began to joke, offering his shop to the Brulé if she would have him as a lover. They were all so cowardly that they laughed at this, and the Levaque improved on it, declaring that she was willing, she was. But he at once became abusive, and pushed them towards the door. As they insisted suppliantly, he treated one brutally. The others on the pavement shouted that he had sold himself to the Company, while Maheude, with her arms in the air, in a burst of avenging indignation, cried out for his death, exclaiming that such a man did not deserve to eat. The return to the settlement was melancholy. When the women came back with empty hands, the men looked at them and then lowered their heads. There was nothing more to be done. The day would end without a spoonful of soup, and the other days extended in an icy shadow, without a ray of hope. They had made up their minds to it, and no one spoke of surrender. This excess of misery made them still more obstinate, mute as tracked beasts, resolved to die at the bottom of their hole rather than come out. Who would dare to be first to speak of submission? They had sworn with their mates to hold together, and hold together they would, as they had held together at the pit when one of them was beneath a landslip. It was as it ought to be. It was a good school for resignation down there. They might well tighten their belts for a week, when they had been swallowing fire and water ever since they were 12 years of age. And their devotion was thus augmented by the pride of soldiers, of men proud of their profession, who in their daily struggle with death had gained a pride in sacrifice. With the Maheus it was a terrible evening. They were all silent, seated before the dying fire in which the last cinders were smoking. After, Having emptied the mattresses handful by handful, they had decided the day before to sell the clock for 3 francs, and the room seemed bare and dead now that the familiar tic tac no longer filled it with sound. The only object of luxury now, in the middle of the sideboard, was the rose cardboard box, an old present from Maheu, which Maheude treasured like a jewel. The two good chairs had gone. Father Bonnemort and the children were squeezed together on an old mossy bench brought in from the garden, and the livid twilight now coming on seemed to increase the cold. "What's to be done?" repeated Maheude, crouching down in the corner by the oven. Étienne stood up, looking at the portraits of the Emperor and Empress stuck against the wall. He would have torn them down long since if the family had not preserved them for ornament. So he murmured, with clenched teeth: "And to think that we can't get 2 sous out of these damned idiots who are watching us starve!" "If I were to take the box," said the woman, very pale, after some hesitation. Maheu, seated on the edge of the table, with his legs dangling and his head on his chest, sat up. "No, I won't have it." Maheude painfully rose and walked round the room. Good God! Was it possible that they were reduced to such misery? The cupboard without a crumb, nothing more to sell, no notion where to get a loaf. And the fire, which was nearly out. She became angry with Alzire, whom she had sent in the morning to glean on the pit bank, and who had come back with empty hands, saying that the Company would not allow gleaning. Did it matter a hang what the Company wanted? As if they were robbing any one by picking up the bits of lost coal! The little girl, in despair, told how a man had threatened to hit her. Then she promised to go back next day, even if she was beaten. "And that imp, Jeanlin!" cried the mother. "Where is he now, I should like to know? He ought to have brought the salad. We can browse on that like beasts, at all events. You will see, he won't come back. Yesterday, too, he slept out. I don't know what he's up to. The rascal always looks as though his belly were full." "Perhaps," said Étienne, "he picks up some sous on the road." She suddenly lifted both fists furiously. "If I knew that, my children beg, I'd rather kill them and myself too." Maheu had again sunk down on the edge of the table. Lénore and Henri, astonished that they had nothing to eat, began to moan, while old Bonnemort, in silence, philosophically rolled his tongue in his mouth to deceive his hunger. No one spoke any more. All were becoming benumbed beneath this aggravation of their evils, the grandfather coughing and spitting out the black phlegm, taken again by rheumatism, which was turning to dropsy; the father asthmatic, and with knees swollen with water; the mother and the little ones scarred by scrofula and hereditary anaemia. No doubt their work made this inevitable. They only complained when the lack of food killed them off, and already they were falling like flies in the settlement. But something must be found for supper. My God! Where was it to be found? What was to be done? Then, in the twilight, which made the room more and more gloomy with its dark melancholy, Étienne, who had been hesitating for a moment, at last decided with aching heart. "Wait for me," he said. "I'll go and see somewhere." And he went out. The idea of Mouquette had occurred to him. She would certainly have a loaf, and would give it willingly. It annoyed him to be thus forced to return to Réquillart. This girl would kiss his hands with her air of an amorous servant. But one did not leave one's friends in trouble; he would still be kind with her, if need be. "I will go and look round too," said Maheude, in her turn. "It's too stupid." She reopened the door after the young man and closed it violently, leaving the others motionless and mute in the faint light of a candle end which Alzire had just lighted. Outside she stopped and thought for a moment, then she entered the Levaques' house. "Tell me, I lent you a loaf the other day. Could you give it me back?" But she stopped herself. What she saw was far from encouraging. The house spoke of misery even more than her own. The Levaque woman, with fixed eyes, was gazing into her burnt out fire, while Levaque, made drunk on his empty stomach by some nail makers, was sleeping on the table. With his back to the wall, Bouteloup was mechanically rubbing his shoulders with the amazement of a good natured fellow who has eaten up his savings and is astonished at having to tighten his belt. "A loaf! Ah, my dear," replied the Levaque woman, "I wanted to borrow another from you." Then, as her husband groaned with pain in his sleep, she pushed his face against the table. "Hold your row, bloody beast! So much the better if it burns your guts. Instead of getting people to pay for your drinks, you ought to have asked 20 sous from a friend." She went on, relieving herself by swearing, in the midst of this dirty household, already abandoned so long that an unbearable smell was exhaling from the floor. Everything might smash up, she didn't care a hang. Her son, that rascal Bébert, had also disappeared since morning, and she shouted that it would be a good riddance if he never came back. Then she said that she would go to bed. At least she could get warm. She hustled Bouteloup. "Come along, up we go. The fire's out. No need to light the candle to see the empty plates. Well, are you coming, Louis? I tell you that we must go to bed. We can cuddle up together there, that's a comfort. And let this damned drunkard die here of cold by himself." When she found herself outside again, Maheude struck resolutely across the gardens towards Pierron's house. She heard laughter. As she knocked, there was sudden silence. It was a full minute before the door was opened. "What! Is it you?" exclaimed Pierron with affected surprise. "I thought it was the doctor." Without allowing her to speak, she went on, pointing to Pierron, who was seated before a large coal fire. "Ah, he makes no progress. He makes no progress at all. His face looks all right. It's in his belly that it takes him. Then he must have warmth. We burn all that we've got." Pierron, in fact, looked very well. His complexion was good, and his flesh fat. It was in vain that he breathed hard in order to play the sick man. Besides, as Maheude came in she perceived a strong smell of rabbit. They had certainly put the dish out of the way. There were crumbs strewed over the table, and in the very midst she saw a forgotten bottle of wine. "Mother has gone to Montsou to try and get a loaf," said Pierron again. "We are cooling our heels, waiting for her." But her voice choked. She had followed her neighbour's glance, and her eyes also fell on the bottle. Immediately she began again, and narrated the story. Yes, it was wine. The Piolaine people had brought her that bottle for her man, who had been ordered by the doctor to take claret, and her thankfulness poured forth in a stream. What good people they were, the young lady especially. She was not proud, going into workpeople's houses and distributing her charities herself. "I see," said Maheude. "I know them." Her heart ached at the idea that the good things always go to the least poor. It was always so, and these Piolaine people had carried water to the river. Why had she not seen them in the settlement? Perhaps, all the same, she might have got something out of them. "I came," she confessed at last, "to know if there was more going with you than with us. Have you just a little vermicelli by way of loan?" Pierron expressed her grief noisily. "Nothing at all, my dear. Not what you can call a grain of semolina. If mother hasn't come back, it's because she hasn't succeeded. We must go to bed supperless." At this moment crying was heard from the cellar, and she grew angry and struck her fist against the door. It was that gadabout Lydie whom she had shut up, she said, to punish her for not having returned until 5 o'clock, after having been roaming about the whole day. One could no longer keep her in order, she was constantly disappearing. Maheude, however, remained standing. She could not make up her mind to leave. The scorched fire filled her with a painful sensation of comfort. The thought that they were eating there enlarged the void in her stomach. Evidently they had sent away the old woman and shut up the child, to blow themselves out with their rabbit. Ah! whatever people might say, when a woman behaved ill, that brought luck to her house. "Good night," she said suddenly. Outside night had come on, and the moon behind the clouds was lighting up the earth with a dubious glow. Instead of traversing the gardens again, Maheude went round, despairing, afraid to go home again. But along the dead frontages all the doors smelled of famine and sounded hollow. What was the good of knocking? There was wretchedness everywhere. for weeks since. They had had nothing to eat. Even the odour of onion had gone, that strong odour which revealed the settlement from afar across the country. Now there was nothing but the smell of old vaults, the dampness of holes in which nothing lives. Vague sounds were dying out, stifled tears, lost oaths, and in the silence which slowly grew heavier one could hear the sleep of hunger coming on, the collapse of bodies thrown across beds and the nightmares of empty bellies. As she passed before the church, she saw a shadow slip rapidly by. A gleam of hope made her hasten, for she had recognized the Montsou priest, Abbé Weir, who said mass on Sundays at the settlement chapel. No doubt he had just come out of the sacristy, where he had been called to settle some affair. With a rounded back he moved quickly on, a fat, meek man, anxious to live at peace with everybody. If he had come at night, it must have been in order not to compromise himself among the miners. It was said, too, that he had just obtained promotion. He had even been seen walking about with his successor, a lean man, with eyes like live coals. Sir, stammered Maheude, but he would not stop. Good night, my good woman. She found herself before her own door. Her legs would no longer carry her, and she went in. No one had stirred. Maheude still sat dejected on the edge of the table. Old Bonnemort and the little ones were huddled together on the bench, for the sake of warmth. And they had not said a word, and the candle had burnt so low that even light would soon fail them. At the sound of the door the children turned their heads. Seeing that their mother brought nothing back, they looked down on the ground again, repressing the longing to cry, for fear of being scolded. Maheude fell back into her place near the dying fire. They asked her no questions, and the silence continued. All had understood, and they thought it useless to weary themselves more by talking. They were now waiting, despairing and without courage, in the last expectation that perhaps Étienne would unearth help somewhere. The minutes went by, and at last they no longer reckoned on this. When Étienne reappeared, he held a cloth containing a dozen potatoes, cooked but cold. "That's all that I have found," he said. With Mouquette also bread was wanting. It was her dinner, which she had forced him to take in this cloth, kissing him with all her heart. "Thanks," he said to Maheude, who offered him his share. "I've eaten over there." It was not true, and he gloomily watched the children throw themselves on the food. The father and mother also restrained themselves, in order to leave more. But the old man greedily swallowed everything. They had to take a potato away from him for Alzire. Then Étienne said that he had heard news. The Company, irritated by the obstinacy of the strikers, talked of giving back their certificates to the compromised miners. Certainly the Company was for war. And a more serious rumour circulated. They boasted of having persuaded a large number of men to go down again. On the next day the Victoire and the Feutry Cantel would be complete. Even at Madeleine and Mirou there would be a third of the men. The Maheus were furious. "By God!" shouted the father, "if there are traitors, we must settle their account." And standing up, yielding to the fury of his suffering: "Tomorrow evening, to the forest! Since they won't let us come to an understanding at the Bon Joyeux, we can be at home in the forest." This cry had aroused old Bonnemort, who had grown drowsy after his gluttony. It was the old rallying cry, the rendezvous where the miners of old days used to plot their resistance to the king's soldiers. "Yes, yes, to Vandame. I'm with you if you go there." Maheude made an energetic gesture. "We will all go. That will finish these injustices and treacheries." Étienne decided that the rendezvous should be announced to all the settlements for the following evening. But the fire was dead, as with the Levaques, and the candle suddenly went out. There was no more coal and no more oil. They had to feel their way to bed in the intense cold, which contracted the skin. The little ones were crying. Section 22. Section 22 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Ferrard. Part 4, Chapter 6. Jeanlin was now well and able to walk, but his legs had united so badly that he limped on both the right and left sides and moved with the gait of a duck, though running as fast as formerly with the skill of a mischievous and thieving animal. On this evening, in the dusk on the Réquillart road, Jeanlin, accompanied by his inseparable friends, Bébert and Lydie, was on the watch. He had taken ambush in a vacant space, behind a paling opposite an obscure grocery shop, situated at the corner of a lane. An old woman, who was nearly blind, displayed there 3 or 4 sacks of lentils and haricots, black with dust, and it was an ancient dried codfish hanging by the door and stained with fly blows, to which his eyes were directed. Twice already he had sent Bébert to unhook it, but each time someone had appeared at a bend in the road, always intruders in the way, one could not attend to one's affairs. A gentleman went by on horseback, and the children flattened themselves at the bottom of the paling, for they recognized M. Hennebeau. Since the strike he was often thus seen along the roads, riding alone amid the rebellious settlements, ascertaining with quiet courage the condition of the country. And never had a stone whistled by his ears. He only met men who were silent and slow to salute him. Most often he came upon lovers, who cared nothing for politics and took their fill of pleasure in holes and corners. He passed by in his trotting mare, with head directed straight forward, so as to disturb nobody, while his heart was swelling with an unappeased desire amid this gormandizing of free love. He distinctly saw these 3 small rascals, the little boys on the little girl in a heap. Even the youngsters were already amusing themselves in their misery. His eyes grew moist and he disappeared, sitting stiffly on his saddle, with his frock coat buttoned up in a military manner. "Damned luck!" said Jeanlin. "This will never finish. Go on, Bébert, hang on to its tail!" But 2 men once more appeared, and the child again stifled an oath when he heard the voice of his brother Zacharie narrating to Mouquet how he had discovered a 2-franc piece sewn into one of his wife's petticoats. They both grinned with satisfaction, slapping each other on the shoulder. Mouquet proposed a game of cross for the next day. They would leave the Avantage at 2 o'clock, and go to the Montoire side, near Martian. Zacharie agreed. What was the good of bothering over the strike? As well amuse oneself, since there's nothing to do. And they turned the corner of the road, when Étienne, who was coming along the canal, stopped them and began to talk. "Are they going to bed here?" said Jeanlin in exasperation. "Nearly night. The old woman will be taking in her sacks." Another miner came down towards the Réquillart. Étienne went off with him, and as they passed the paling the child heard them speak of the forest. They had been obliged to put off the rendezvous to the following day, for fear of not being able to announce it in one day to all the settlements. "I say," he whispered to his 2 mates, "the big affair is for tomorrow. We'll go, eh? We can get off in the afternoon." And the road being at last free, he sent Bébert off. "Courage! Hang on to its tail! And look out! The old woman's got her broom!" Fortunately the night had grown dark. Bébert, with a leap, hung on to the cod so that the string broke. He ran away, waving it like a kite, followed by the 2 others, all 3 galloping. The woman came out of her shop in astonishment, without understanding or being able to distinguish this band now lost in the darkness. These scoundrels had become the terror of the country. They gradually spread themselves over it like a horde of savages. At first they had been satisfied with the yard at the Voreux, tumbling into the stock of coal, from which they would emerge looking like negroes, playing at hide and seek amid the supply of wood, in which they lost themselves as in the depths of a virgin forest. Then they had taken the pit bank by assault. They would seat themselves on it and slide down the bare portions still boiling with interior fires. They glided among the briars in the older parts, hiding for the whole day, occupied in the quiet little games of mischievous mice, and they were constantly enlarging their conquests, scuffling among the piles of bricks until blood came, running about the fields and eating without bread all sorts of milky herbs, searching the banks of the canals to take fish from the mud and swallow them raw, and pushing still farther, they travelled for kilometres as far as the thickets of Vandame, under which they gorged themselves with strawberries in the spring, with nuts and bilberries in summer. Soon the immense plain belonged to them. What drove them thus from Montsou to Martians, constantly on the roads with the eyes of young wolves, was the growing love of plunder. Jeanlin remained the captain of these expeditions, leading the troop on to all sorts of prey, ravaging the onion fields, pillaging the orchards, attacking shop windows. In the country, people accused the miners on strike and talked of a vast organized band. One day, even, he had forced Lydie to steal from her mother, and made her bring him 24 sticks of barley sugar, which Pierron kept in a bottle on one of the boards in her window. And the little girl, who was well beaten, had not betrayed him because she trembled so before his authority. The worst was that he always gave himself the lion's share. Weir also had to bring him the booty, happy if the captain did not hit him and keep it all. For some time Jeanlin had abused his authority. He would beat Lydie as one beats one's lawful wife, and he profited by Bébert' credulity to send him on unpleasant adventures, amused at making a fool of this big boy, who was stronger than himself, and could have knocked him over with a blow of his fist. He felt contempt for both of them and treated them as slaves, telling them that he had a princess for his mistress and that they were unworthy to appear before her. And, in fact, during the past week, he would suddenly disappear at the end of a road or a turning in a path, no matter where it might be, after having ordered them with a terrible air to go back to the settlement. But first he would pocket the booty. This was what happened on the present occasion. "Give it up," he said, snatching the cod from his mate's hands when they stopped, all three, at a bend in the road near Réquillart. Bébert protested. "I want some, you know. I took it." "Eh, what?" he cried. "You'll have some if I give you some. Not to night, sure enough. To morrow, if there's any left." He pushed Lydie, and placed both of them in line like soldiers shouldering arms. Then, passing behind them: "Now you must stay there 5 minutes without turning. By God, if you do turn, there will be beasts that will eat you up, and then you will go straight back. And if Bébert touches Lydie on the way I shall know it, and I shall hit you." Then he disappeared in the shadow, so lightly that the sound of his naked feet could not be heard. The two children remained motionless for the 5 minutes without looking round, for fear of receiving a blow from the invisible. Slowly a great affection had grown up between them in their common terror. He was always thinking of taking her and pressing her very tight between his arms, as he had seen others do, and she, too, would have liked it, for it would have been a change for her to be so nicely caressed. But neither of them would have allowed themselves to disobey. When they went away, although the night was very dark, they did not even kiss each other. They walked side by side, tender and despairing, certain that if they touched one another the captain would strike them from behind. Étienne, at the same hour, had entered Réquillart. The evening before, Mouquet had begged him to return, and he returned, ashamed, feeling an inclination which he refused to acknowledge, for this girl who adored him like a Christ. It was, besides, with the intention of breaking it off. He would see her, he would explain to her that she ought no longer to pursue him, on account of the mates. It was not a time for pleasure. It was dishonest to amuse oneself thus when people were dying of hunger. And not having found her at home, he had decided to wait and watch the shadows of the passers by. Beneath the ruined steeple the old shaft opened, half blocked up. Above the black hole a beam stood erect, and with a fragment of roof at the top it had the profile of a gallows. In the broken walling of the curbs stood 2 trees, a mountain ash and a plane, which seemed to grow from the depths of the earth. It was a corner of abandoned wildness, the grassy and fibrous entry of a gulf, embarrassed with old wood. planted with hawthorns and sloe trees, which were peopled in the spring by warblers in their nests. Wishing to avoid the great expense of keeping it up, the Company, for the last 10 years, had proposed to fill up this dead pit, but they were waiting to install an air shaft in the Voreux, for the ventilation furnace of the two pits, which communicated, was placed at the foot of Réquillart, of which the former winding shaft served as a conduit. They were content to consolidate the tubbing by beams placed across, preventing extraction, and they had neglected the upper galleries to watch only over the lower gallery, in which blazed the furnace, the enormous coal fire, with so powerful a draught that the rush of air produced the wind of a tempest from one end to the other of the neighbouring mine. As a precaution, in order that they could still go up and down, the order had been given to furnish the shaft with ladders. Only, as no one took charge of them, the ladders were rotting with dampness, and in some places had already given way. Above, a large brier stopped the entry of the passage, and as the first ladder had lost some rungs, it was necessary, in order to reach it, to hang on to a root of the mountain ash and then to take one's chance and drop into the blackness. Étienne was waiting patiently, hidden behind a bush, when he heard a long rustling among the branches. He thought at first that it was the scared flight of a snake. But the sudden gleam of a match astonished him, and he was stupefied on recognizing Jeanlin, who was lighting a candle and burying himself in the earth. He was seized with curiosity, and approached the hole. The child had disappeared, and a faint gleam came from the second ladder. Étienne hesitated a moment, and then let himself go, holding on to the roots. He thought for a moment that he was about to fall down the whole 580 metres of the mine, but at last he felt a rung, and descended gently. Jeanlin had evidently heard nothing. Étienne constantly saw the light sinking beneath him, while the little one's shadow, colossal and disturbing, danced with the deformed gait of his distorted limbs. He kicked his legs about with the skill of a monkey, catching on with hands, feet, or chin where the rungs were wanting. Ladders, 7 metres in length, followed one another, some still firm, others shaky, yielding and almost broken. The steps were narrow and green, so rotten that one seemed to walk in moss, and as one went down the heat grew suffocating, the heat of an oven proceeding from the air shaft, which was, fortunately, not very active now the strike was on, or when the furnace devoured its 5,000 kilograms of coal a day. One could not have risked oneself here without scorching one's hair. "What a damned little toad!" exclaimed Étienne in a stifled voice. "Where the devil is he going to?" Twice he had nearly fallen. His feet slid on the damp wood. If he had only had a candle like the child! But he struck himself every minute. He was only guided by the vague gleam that bled beneath him. He had already reached the 20th ladder, and the descent still continued. Then he counted them: 21, 22, 23, and he still went down and down. His head seemed to be swelling with the heat, and he thought that he was falling into a furnace. At last he reached a landing place, and he saw the candle going off along a gallery. 30 ladders! That made about 210 metres. "Is he going to drag me about long?" he thought. "He must be going to bury himself in the stable." But on the left, the path which led to the stable was closed by a landslip. The journey began again, now more painful and more dangerous. Frightened bats flew about and clung to the roof of the gallery. He had to hasten so as not to lose sight of the light. Only where the child passed with ease, with the suppleness of a serpent, he could not glide through without bruising his limbs. This gallery, like all the older passages, was narrow, and grew narrower every day from the constant fall of soil. At certain places it was a mere tube which would eventually be effaced. In the strangling labour, the torn and broken wood became a peril, threatening to saw into his flesh, or to run him through with the points of splinters, sharp as swords. He could only advance with precaution, on his knees or belly, feeling in the darkness before him. Suddenly a band of rats stamped over him. running from his neck to his feet in their galloping flight. "Blast it all, haven't we got to the end yet?" he grumbled, with aching back and out of breath. They were there. At the end of a kilometre the tube enlarged. They reached a part of the gallery which was admirably preserved. It was the end of the old haulage passage, cut across the bed like a natural grotto. He was obliged to stop. He saw the child afar, placing his candle between two stones, and putting himself at ease with the quiet and relieved air of a man who was glad to be at home again. This gallery end was completely changed into a comfortable dwelling. In a corner on the ground a pile of hay made a soft couch. On some old planks, placed like a table, there were bread, potatoes, and bottles of gin already opened. It was a real brigand's cavern, with booty piled up for weeks, even useless booty like soap and blacking, stolen for the pleasure of stealing. And the child, quite alone, in the midst of this plunder, was enjoying it like a selfish brigand. "I say, then, is this how you make fun of people?" cried Étienne, when he had breathed for a moment. "You come and gorge yourself here, when we are dying of hunger up above?" Jeanlin, astounded, was trembling, but recognizing the young man, he quickly grew calm. "Will you come and dine with me?" he said at last. "Eh? A bit of grilled cod? You shall see." He had not let go his cod, and he began to scrape off the fly blows properly with a fine new knife, one of those little dagger knives with bone handles, on which mottoes are inscribed. This one simply bore the word Amour. "You have a fine knife," remarked Étienne. "It's a present from Lydie," replied Jeanlin, who neglected to add that Lydie had stolen it, by his orders, from a huckster at Montsou stationed before the Tête Coupée bar. Then, as he still scraped, he added proudly: "Isn't it comfortable in my house? It's a bit warmer than up above, and it feels a lot better." Étienne had seated himself, and was amused in making him talk. He was no longer angry. He felt interested in this debauched child, who was so brave and so industrious in his vices. And, in fact, he tasted a certain comfort in the bottom of this hole. The heat was not too great. An equal temperature reigned here at all seasons, the warmth of a bath, while the rough December wind was chapping the skins of the miserable people on the earth. As they grew old, the galleries became purified with noxious gases, all the fire damp had gone, and one only smelled now the odour of old fermented wood, a subtle ethereal odour, as if sharpened with a dash of cloves. This wood, besides, had become curious to look at, with a yellowish pallor of marble, fringed with whitish thread lace, flaky vegetations, which seemed to drape it with an embroidery of silk and pearls. In other places the timber was bristling with toadstools, and there were flights of white butterflies, snowy flies, and spiders, a decolorized population forever ignorant of the sun. "Then you're not afraid?" asked Étienne. Jeanlin looked at him in astonishment. "Afraid of what? I am quite alone." But the cod was at last scraped. He lighted a little fire of wood, brought out the pan and grilled it. Then he cut a loaf in two. It was a terribly salt feast, but exquisite all the same for strong stomachs. Étienne had accepted his share. "I am not astonished you get fat, while we are all growing lean. Do you know that it is beastly to stuff yourself like this? And the others? You don't think of them?" "Oh, why are the others such fools?" "Well, you're right to hide yourself, for if your father knew you stole, he would settle you." "What! When the bourgeois are stealing from us? It's you who are always saying so. If I nab this loaf at Maigrat's, you may be pretty sure it's a loaf he owed us." The young man was silent, with his mouth full, and felt troubled. He looked at him, with his muzzle, his green eyes, his large ears, a degenerate abortion with an obscure intelligence and savage cunning, slowly slipping back into the animality of old. The mine which had made him had just finished him by breaking his legs. "And Lydie?" asked Étienne again. "Do you bring her here sometimes?" Jeanlin laughed contemptuously. "The little one? Ah, no, not I. Women blab." And he went on laughing, filled with immense disdain for Lydie and Bébert. Who had ever seen such boobies? To think that they swallowed all his humbug and went away with empty hands while he ate the cod in this warm place tickled his sides with amusement. Then he concluded, with the gravity of a little philosopher: "Much better be alone, then there's no falling out." Étienne had finished his bread. He drank a gulp of the gin. For a moment he asked himself if he ought not to make a bad return for Jeanlin's hospitality by bringing him up to daylight by the ear, and forbidding him to plunder any more by the threat of telling everything to his father. But as he examined this deep retreat an idea occurred to him. Who knows if there might not be need for it, either for mates or for himself, in case things should come to the worst up above? He made the child swear not to sleep out, as had sometimes happened when he forgot himself in his hay, and taking a candle end, he went away first, leaving him to pursue quietly his domestic affairs. Mouquette, seated on a beam in spite of the great cold, had grown desperate in waiting for him. When she saw him she leapt on to his neck. It was as though he had plunged a knife into her heart when he said that he wished to see her no more. Good God! Why? Did she not love him enough? Fearing to yield to the desire to enter with her, he drew her towards the road, and explained to her as gently as possible that she was compromising him in the eyes of his mates, that she was compromising the political cause. She was astonished. What had that got to do with politics? At last the thought occurred to her that he blushed at being seen with her. She was not wounded, however. It was quite natural, and she proposed that he should rebuff her before people, so as to seem to have broken with her. But he would see her just once sometimes. In distraction she implored him. She swore to keep out of sight. She would not keep him 5 minutes. He was touched, but still refused. It was necessary. Then, as he left her, he wished at least to kiss her. They had gradually reached the first houses of Montsou, and were standing with their arms round one another beneath a large round moon, when a woman passed near them with a sudden start, as though she had knocked against a stone. "Who is that?" asked Étienne anxiously. "It's Catherine," replied Mouquette. "She's coming back from Jean Bart." The woman now was going away, with lowered head and feeble limbs, looking very tired. And the young man gazed at her, in despair at having been seen by her, his heart aching with an unreasonable remorse. Had she not been with a man? Had she not made him suffer with the same suffering here, on this Réquillart road, when she had given herself to that man? But all the same, he was grieved to have done the like to her. "Shall I tell you what it is?" whispered Mouquette, in tears, as she left him. "If you don't want me, it's because you want some one else." On the next day the weather was superb. It was one of those clear frosty days, the beautiful winter days when the hard earth rings like crystal beneath the feet. Jeanlin had gone off at 1 o'clock, but he had to wait for Bébert behind the church, and they nearly set out without Lydie, whose mother had again shut her up in the cellar, and only now liberated her to put a basket on her arm, telling her that if she did not bring it back full of dandelions, she should be shut up with the rats all night long. She was frightened, therefore, and wished to go at once for salad. Jeanlin dissuaded her. They would see later on. For a long time Poland, Rasseneur's big rabbit, had attracted his attention. He was passing before the Avantage when, just then, the rabbit came out on to the road. With a leap he seized her by the ears, stuffed her into the little girl's basket, and all three rushed away. They would amuse themselves finally by making her run like a dog as far as the forest. But they stopped to gaze at Zacharie and Mouquet, who, after having drunk a glass with 2 other mates, had begun their big game of cross. The stake was a new cap and a red handkerchief, deposited with Rasseneur. The 4 players, 2 against 2, were bidding for the first turn from the Voreux to the Pelot farm, nearly 3 kilometres, and it was Zacharie who won, with 7 strokes, while Mouquet required 8. They had placed the ball, the little boxwood egg, on the pavement with one end up. Each was holding his cross, the mallet with its bent iron, long handle, and tight strung network. 2 o'clock struck as they set out. Zacharie, in a masterly manner, at his first stroke, composed of a series of three, sent the ball more than 400 yards across the beetroot fields, where it was forbidden to play in the villages and on the streets, where people might be killed. Mouquet, who was also a good player, sent off the ball with so vigorous an arm that a single stroke brought the ball 150 metres behind. And the game went on, backwards and forwards, always running, their feet bruised by the frozen ridges of the ploughed fields. At first Jeanlin, Bébert, and Lydie had trotted behind the players, delighted with their vigorous strokes. Then they remembered Poland, whom they were shaking up in the basket, and leaving the game in the open country, they took out the rabbit, inquisitive to see how fast she could run. She went off, and they fled after her. It was a chase lasting an hour at full speed, with constant turns, with shouts to frighten her, and arms opened and closed on emptiness. If she had not been at the beginning of pregnancy, they would never have caught her again. As they were panting, the sound of oaths made them turn their heads. They had just come upon the cross party again, and Zacharie had nearly split open his brother's skull. The players were now at their fourth turn. From the Paulo farm they had gone off to the Quatre Chemins, then from the Quatre Chemins to Montoire, and now they were going in 6 strokes from Montoire to Prés des Vaches. That made 2 leagues and a half in an hour. And besides, they had had drinks at the Estaminet Vincent and at the Trois Sages bar. Mouquet this time was ahead. He had 2 more strokes to play, and his victory was certain, when Zacharie, grinning as he availed himself of his privilege, played with so much skill that the ball rolled into a deep pit. Mouquet's partner could not get it out. It was a disaster. All 4 shouted. The party was excited, for they were neck to neck. It was necessary to begin again. From the Prés des Vaches it was not 2 kilometres to the point of Air Roses in 5 strokes. There they would refresh themselves at Les Renards. But Jeanlin had an idea. He let them go on, and pulled out of his pocket a piece of string which he tied to one of Poland's legs, the left hind leg, and it was very amusing. The rabbit ran before the 3 young rascals, waddling along in such an extraordinary manner that they had never laughed so much before. Afterwards they fastened it round her neck, and let her run off, and as she grew tired they dragged her on her belly or on her back, just like a little carriage. That lasted for more than an hour. She was moaning when they quickly put her back into the basket near the wood at Cruchot, on hearing the players whose game they had once more came across. Zacharie, Mouquet, and the 2 others were getting over the kilometres, with no other rest than the time for a drink at all the inns which they had fixed on as their goals. From the Herbe Rousse they had gone on to Bouchy, then to Croix de Pierre, then to Chamblay. The earth rang beneath the helter-skelter of their feet, rushing untiringly after the ball, which bounded over the ice. The weather was good, they did not fall in, they only ran the risk of breaking their legs. In the dry air the great cross blows exploded like firearms. Their muscular hands grasped the strong handle, their entire bodies were bent forward, as though to slay an ox. And this went on for hours, from one end of the plain to the other, over ditches and hedges and the slopes of the road, the low walls of the enclosures. One needed to have good bellows in one's chest and iron hinges in one's knees. The pikemen thus rubbed off the rust of the mine with impassioned zeal. There were some so enthusiastic at 25 that they could do 10 leagues. At 40 they played no more, they were too heavy. 5 o'clock struck. The twilight was already coming on. One more turn to the forest of Vandame to decide who had gained the cap and the handkerchief. And Zacharie joked, with his chaffing indifference for politics. It would be fine to tumble down over there in the midst of the mates. As to Jeanlin, ever since leaving the settlement he had been aiming at the forest, though apparently only scouring the fields. With an indignant gesture he threatened Lydie, who was full of remorse and fear, and talked of going back to the Voreux to gather dandelions. Were they going to abandon the meeting? He wanted to know what the old people would say. He pushed Bébert and proposed to enliven the end of the journey as far as the trees by detaching Poland and pursuing her with stones. His real idea was to kill her. He wanted to take her off and eat her at the bottom of his hole at Réquillart. The rabbit ran ahead, with nose in the air and ears back. A stone grazed her back, another cut her tail, and in spite of the growing darkness she would have been done for if the young rogues had not noticed Étienne and Maheu standing in the middle of a glade. They threw themselves on the animal in desperation, and put her back in the basket. Almost at the same minute Zacharie, Mouquet, and the two others, with their last blow at crosse, drove the ball within a few metres of the glade. They all came into the midst of the rendezvous. Through the whole country, by the roads and pathways of the flat plain, ever since twilight, there had been a long procession, a rustling of silent shadows, moving separately or in groups towards the violet thickets of the forest. Every settlement was emptied, the women and children themselves set out as if for a walk beneath the great clear sky. Now the roads were growing dark. This walking crowd, all gliding towards the same goal, could no longer be distinguished. But one felt it, the confused tramping, moved by one soul. Between the hedges, among the bushes, there was only a light rustling, a vague rumour of the voices of the night. M. Hennebeau, who was at this hour returning home mounted on his mare, listened to these vague sounds. He had met couples, long rows of strollers, on this beautiful winter night, more lovers who were going to take their pleasure, mouth to mouth, behind the walls. Was it not what he always met? Girls tumbled over at the bottom of every ditch, beggars who crammed themselves with the only joy that costs nothing. And these fools complained of life, when they could take their supreme fill of this happiness of love! Willingly would he have starved as they did, if he could begin life again with a woman who would give herself to him on a heap of stones, with all her strength and all her heart. His misfortune was without consolation, and he envied these wretches. With lowered head he went back, riding his horse at a slackened pace, rendered desperate by these long sounds, lost in the depth of the black country, in which he heard only kisses. End of Section 22. Section 23 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 4, Chapter 7. It was the Plan des Dames, that vast glade just opened up by the felling of trees. It spread out in a gentle slope, surrounded by tall thickets and superb beeches with straight regular trunks, which formed a white colonnade patched with green lichens. Fallen giants were also lying in the grass, while on the left a mass of logs formed a geometrical cube. The cold was sharpening with the twilight, and the frozen moss crackled beneath the feet. There was black darkness on the earth, while the tall branches showed against the pale sky, where a full moon coming above the horizon would soon extinguish the stars. Nearly 3,000 colliers had come to the rendezvous, a swarming crowd of men, women, and children, gradually filling the glade and spreading out afar beneath the trees. Late arrivals were still coming up, a flood of heads drowned in shadow and stretching as far as the neighbouring copses. A rumbling arose from them, like that of a storm, in this motionless and frozen forest. At the top, dominating the slope, Étienne stood with Rasseneur and Maheu. A quarrel had broken out, one could hear their voices in sudden bursts. Near them some men were listening, Levaque with clenched fists, Pierron turning his back and much annoyed that he had no longer been able to feign a fever. There were also Father Bonnemort and old Mouque, seated side by side on a stump, lost in deep meditation. Then behind were the chaffers, Zacharie, Mouquet, and others who had come to make fun of the thing; while gathered together in a very different spirit the women in a group were as serious as if at church. Maheude silently shook her head at the Levaque woman's muttered oaths. Philoméne was coughing, her bronchitis having come back with the winter. Only Mouquette was showing her teeth with laughter, amused at the way in which Mother Brulé was abusing her daughter, an unnatural creature who had sent her away that she might gorge herself with rabbit, a creature who had sold herself and who fattened on her man's cowardice. And Jeanlin had planted himself on the pile of wood, hoisting up Lydie and making Bébert follow him, all three higher up in the air than any one else. The quarrel was raised by Rasseneur, who wished to proceed formally to the election of officers. He was enraged by his defeat at the Bon Joyeux, and had sworn to have his revenge; for he flattered himself that he could regain his old authority when he was once face to face, not with the delegates, but with the miners themselves. Étienne was disgusted, and thought the idea of officers was ridiculous in this forest. They ought to act in a revolutionary fashion, like savages, since they were tracked like wolves. As the dispute threatened to drag on, he took possession of the crowd at once by jumping on to the trunk of a tree and shouting: "Comrades! Comrades!" The confused roar of the crowd died down into a long sigh, while Maheu stifled Rasseneur's protestations. Étienne went on in a loud voice: "Comrades, since they forbid us to speak, since they send the police after us as if we were robbers, we have come to talk here. Here we are free, we are at home. No one can silence us any more than they can silence the birds and beasts." A thunder of cries and exclamations responded to him. "Yes, yes, the forest is ours. We can talk here. Go on." Then Étienne stood for a moment motionless on the tree trunk. The moon, still beneath the horizon, only lit up the topmost branches, and the crowd, remaining in the darkness, stood above it at the top of the slope, like a bar of shadow. He raised his arm with a slow movement, and began. But his voice was not fierce; he spoke in the cold tones of a simple envoy of the people who was rendering his account. He was delivering the discourse which the Commissioner of Police had cut short at the Bon Joyeux, and he began a rapid history of the strike, affecting a certain scientific eloquence. Facts, nothing but facts. At first he spoke of his dislike to the strike. The miners had not desired it; it was the management which had provoked it with the new timbering tariff. Then he recalled the first step taken by the delegates in going to the manager, the bad faith of the directors, and, later on, the second step, the tardy concession, the 10 centimes given up, after the attempt to rob them. Now he showed by figures the exhaustion of the Provident Fund, and pointed out the use that had been made of the help sent, briefly excusing the International, Pluchart, and the others, for not being able to do more for them in the midst of the cares of their conquest of the world. So the situation was getting worse every day. The Company was giving back certificates and threatening to hire men from Belgium. Besides, it was intimidating the weak, and had forced a certain number of miners to go down again. He preserved his monotonous voice, as if to insist on the bad news. He said that hunger was victorious, that hope was dead, and that the struggle had reached the last feverish efforts of courage. And then he suddenly concluded, without raising his voice: "It is in these circumstances, mates, that you have to take a decision to night. Do you want the strike to go on? And if so, what do you expect to do to beat the Company?" A deep silence fell from the starry sky. The crowd, which could not be seen, was silent in the night beneath these words which choked every heart, and a sigh of despair could be heard through the trees. But Étienne was already continuing, with a change in his voice. It was no longer the secretary of the association who was speaking, it was the chief of a band, the apostle who was bringing truth. Could it be that any were cowardly enough to go back on their word? What? They were to suffer in vain for a month, and then to go back to the pits with lowered heads, so that the everlasting wretchedness might begin over again? Would it not be better to die at once in the effort to destroy this tyranny of capital, which was starving the worker? Always to submit to hunger up to the moment when hunger will again throw the calmest into revolt, Was it not a foolish game which could not go on for ever? And he pointed to the exploited miners, bearing alone the disasters of every crisis, reduced to go without food as soon as the necessities of competition lowered net prices. No, the timbering tariff could not be accepted. It was only a disguised effort to economize on the Company's part. They wanted to rob every man of an hour's work a day. It was too much this time. The day was coming when the miserable, pushed to extremity, would deal justice. He stood with his arms in the air. At the word justice, the crowd, shaken by a long shudder, broke out into applause which rolled along with the sound of dry leaves. Voices cried: "Justice! It is time! Justice!" Gradually Étienne grew heated. He had not Rasseneur's easy flowing abundance. Words often failed him. He had to force his phrases, bringing them out with an effort, which he emphasized by a movement of his shoulders. Only in these continual shocks he came upon familiar images, which seized on his audience by their energy, while his workman's gestures, his elbows in and then extended, with his fists thrust out, his jaws suddenly advanced as if to bite, had also an extraordinary effect on his mates. They all said that if he was not big, he made himself heard. "The wage system is a new form of slavery," he began again, in a more sonorous voice. "The mine ought to belong to the miner, as the sea belongs to the fisherman, and the earth to the peasant. Do you see? The mine belongs to you, to all of you, who, for a century, have paid for it with so much blood and misery." He boldly entered on obscure questions of law, and lost himself in the difficulties of the special regulations concerning mines. The subsoil, like the soil, belonged to the nation; only an odious privilege gave the monopoly of it to the companies, all the more since, at Montsou, the pretended legality of the concession was complicated by treaties formerly made with the owners of the old fiefs, according to the ancient custom of Hainault. The miners, then, had only to reconquer their property. And with extended hands he indicated the whole country beyond the forest. At this moment the moon, which had risen above the horizon, lit him up as it glided from behind the high branches. When the crowd, which was still in shadow, saw him thus, white with light, distributing fortune with his open hands, they applauded anew by prolonged clapping. "Yes, yes, he's right! Bravo!" Then Étienne trotted out his favourite subject, the assumption of the instruments of production by the collectivity, as he kept on saying in a phrase the pedantry of which greatly pleased him. At the present time his evolution was completed. Having set out with the sentimental fraternity of the novice and the need for reforming the wage system, he had reached the political idea of its suppression. Since the meeting at Bon Joyeux, his collectivism, still humanitarian and without a formula, had stiffened into a complicated programme which he discussed scientifically, article by article. First, he affirmed that freedom could only be obtained by the destruction of the state. Then, when the people had obtained possession of the government, reforms would begin, return to the primitive commune, substitution of an equal and free family for the moral and oppressive family, absolute equality, civil, political, and economic, individual independence guaranteed, thanks to the possession of the integral product of the instruments of work; finally, free vocational education, paid for by the collectivity. This led to the total reconstruction of the old rotten society. He attacked marriage, the right of bequest, he regulated every one's fortune. He threw down the iniquitous monument of the dead centuries with a great movement of his arm, always the same movement, the movement of the reaper who is cutting down a ripe harvest; and then with the other hand he reconstructed, he built up the future humanity, the edifice of truth and justice rising in the dawn of the 20th century. In this state of mental tension reason trembled, and only the sectarian's fixed idea was left. The scruples of sensibility and of good sense were lost. Nothing seemed easier than the realization of this new world. He had foreseen everything; he spoke of it as of a machine which he could put together in 2 hours, and he stuck at neither fire nor blood. Our turn is come," he broke out for the last time. "Now it is for us to have power and wealth." The cheering rolled up to him from the depths of the forest. The moon now whitened the whole of the glade, and cut into living waves the sea of heads, as far as the dimly visible copses in the distance between the great grey trunks. And in the icy air there was a fury of faces, of gleaming eyes, of open mouths, a rut of famishing men, women, and children, let loose on the just pillage of the ancient wealth they had been deprived of. They no longer felt the cold; these burning words had warmed them to the bone. Religious exultation raised them from the earth, a fever of hope like that of the Christians of the early church awaiting the near coming of justice. Many obscure phrases had escaped them; they could not properly understand this technical and abstract reasoning, but the very obscurity and abstraction still further enlarged the field of promises and lifted them into a dazzling region. What a dream! To be masters, to suffer no more, to enjoy at last. "That's it, by God! It's our turn now. Down with the exploiters!" The women were delirious. Maheude, losing her calmness, was seized with the vertigo of hunger. The Levaque woman shouted. Old Brulé, carried out of herself, was brandishing her witch like arms. Philoméne was shaken by a spasm of coughing, and Mouquette was so excited that she cried out words of tenderness to the orator. Among the men Maheu was won over and shouted with anger, between Pierron, who was trembling, and Levaque, who was talking too much, while the chaffers, Zacharie and Mouquet, though trying to make fun of things, were feeling uncomfortable and were surprised that their mate could talk on so long without having a drink. But on top of the pile of wood, Jeanlin was making more noise than any one, egging on Bébert and Lydie and shaking the basket in which Poland lay. The clamour began again. Étienne was enjoying the intoxication of his popularity. He held power, as it were, materialized in these 3,000 breasts, whose hearts he could move with a word. Souvarine, if he had cared to come, would have applauded his ideas so far as he recognized them, pleased with his pupil's progress in anarchism and satisfied with the programme, except the article on education, a relic of silly sentimentality, for men needed to be dipped in a bath of holy and salutary ignorance. As to Rasseneur, he shrugged his shoulders with contempt and anger. "You shall let me speak," he shouted to Étienne. The latter jumped from the tree trunk. "Speak, we shall see if they'll hear you." Already Rasseneur had replaced him, and with a gesture demanded silence. But the noise did not cease. His name went round from the first ranks, who had recognized him, to the last, lost beneath the beeches, and they refused to hear him. He was an overturned idol. The mere sight of him angered his old disciples. His facile elocution, his flowing, good natured speech, which had so long charmed them, was now treated like warm gruel made to put cowards to sleep. In vain he talked through the noise, trying to take up again his discourse of conciliation, the impossibility of changing the world by a stroke of the law, the necessity of allowing the social evolution time to accomplish itself. They joked him, they hissed him. His defeat at the Bon Joyeux was now beyond repair. At last they threw handfuls of frozen moss at him, and a woman cried in a shrill voice, "Down with the traitor!" He explained that the miner could not be the proprietor of the mine, as the weaver is of his loom, and he said that he preferred sharing in the benefits, the interested worker becoming the child of the house. "Down with the traitor!" repeated 1,000 voices, while stones began to whistle by. Then he turned pale, and despair filled his eyes with tears. His whole existence was crumbling down. 20 years of ambitious comradeship were breaking down beneath the ingratitude of the crowd. He came down from the tree trunk, with no strength to go on, struck to the heart. "That makes you laugh," he stammered, addressing the triumphant Étienne. "Good! I hope your turn will come. It will come, I tell you." And as if to reject all responsibility for the evils which he foresaw, he made a large gesture and went away alone across the country, pale and silent. Hoots arose, and then they were surprised to see Father Bonnemort standing on the trunk and about to speak in the midst of the tumult. Up till now Mouque and he had remained absorbed, with that air that they always had of reflecting on former things. No doubt he was yielding to one of those sudden crises of garrulity which sometimes made the past stir in him so violently that recollections rose and flowed from his lips for hours at a time. There was deep silence, and they listened to this old man, who was like a pale spectre beneath the moon, and as he narrated things without any immediate relation with the discussion, long histories which no one could understand, the impression was increased. He was talking of his youth. He described the death of his two uncles who were crushed at the Voreux. Then he turned to the inflammation of the lungs which had carried off his wife. He kept to his main idea, however. Things had never gone well and never would go well. Thus in the forest 500 of them had come together because the king would not lessen the hours of work. But he stopped short, and began to tell of another strike. He had seen so many. They all broke out under these trees, here at the Plain des Dames, lower down at the Charbonnerie, still farther towards the Sault de l'Aube. Sometimes it froze, sometimes it was hot. One evening it had rained so much that they had gone back again without being able to say anything, and the king's soldiers came up, and it finished with volleys of musketry. We raised our hands like this, and we swore not to go back again. Ah, I have sworn, yes, I have sworn. The crowd listened gapingly, feeling disturbed, when Étienne, who had watched the scene, jumped on to the fallen tree, keeping the old man at his side. He had just recognized Chaval among their friends in the first row. The idea that Catherine must be there had roused a new ardour within him, the desire to be applauded in her presence. "Mates, you have heard. This is one of our old men, and this is what he has suffered, and what our children will suffer, if we don't have done with the robbers and butchers." He was terrible. Never had he spoken so violently. With one arm he supported old Bonnemort, exhibiting him as a banner of misery and mourning, and crying for vengeance. In a few rapid phrases he went back to the first Maheu. He showed the whole family used up at the mine, devoured by the Company, hungrier than ever after 100 years of work. And contrasting with the Maheus he pointed to the big bellies of the directors, sweating gold, a whole band of shareholders, going on for a century like kept women, doing nothing but enjoy with their bodies. Was it not fearful? A race of men dying down below, from father to son, so that bribes of wine could be given to ministers, and generations of great lords and bourgeois could give feasts or fatten by their firesides. He had studied the diseases of the miners. He made them all march past with their awful details: anaemia, scrofula, black bronchitis, the asthma which chokes, and the rheumatism which paralyzes. These wretches were thrown as food to the engines, and penned up like beasts in the settlements. The great companies absorbed them, regulating their slavery, threatening to enrol all the workers of the nation, millions of hands, to bring fortune to 1,000 idlers. But the miner was no longer an ignorant brute, crushed within the bowels of the earth. An army was springing up from the depths of the pits, a harvest of citizens whose seed would germinate and burst through the earth some sunny day. And they would see then if, after 40 years of service, any one would dare to offer a pension of 150 francs to an old man of 60, who spat out coal, and whose legs were swollen with the water from the cuttings. Yes, labour would demand an account from capital, that impersonal god, unknown to the worker, crouching down somewhere in his mysterious sanctuary, where he sucked the life out of the starvelings who nourished him. They would go down there. They would at last succeed in seeing his face by the gleam of incendiary fires. They would drown him in blood, that filthy swine, that monstrous idol, gorged with human flesh. He was silent, but his arm, still extended in space, indicated the enemy down there, he knew not where, from one end of the earth to the other. This time the clamour of the crowd was so great that people at Montsou heard it and looked towards Vandame, seized with anxiety at the thought that some terrible landslip had occurred. Night birds rose above the trees and clear open sky. He now concluded his speech. Mates, what is your decision? Do you vote for the strike to go on?" Their voices yelled, "Yes, yes." "And what steps do you decide on? We are sure of defeat if cowards go down to morrow." Their voices rose again with the sound of a tempest. "Kill the cowards!" "Then you decide to call them back to duty and to their sworn word. That is what we could do. Present ourselves at the pits, bring back the traitors by our presence, show the Company that we are all agreed, and that we are going to die rather than yield." "That's it! To the pits! To the pits!" While he was speaking Étienne had looked for Catherine among the pale shouting heads before him. She was certainly not there, but he still saw Chaval, affecting to jeer, shrugging his shoulders, but devoured by jealousy and ready to sell himself for a little of this popularity. "And if there are any spies among us, mates," Étienne went on, "let them look out. They're known. Yes, I can see Vandame colliers here who have not left their pit." "Is that meant for me?" asked Chaval, with an air of bravado. "For you, and for any one else. But since you speak, you ought to understand that those who eat have nothing to do with those who are starving. You work at Jean Bart." A chaffing voice interrupted. "Oh, he work! He's got a wife who works for him." Chaval swore, while the blood rose to his face. "By God! Is it forbidden to work, then?" "Yes," said Étienne. "When your mates are enduring misery for the good of all, it is forbidden to go over, like a selfish sneaking coward, to the master's side. If the strike had been general we should have got the best of it long ago. Not a single man at Vandame ought to have gone down when Montsou is resting. To accomplish the great stroke work should be stopped in the entire country, at Monsieur Deneulin's as well as here. Do you understand? There are only traitors in the Jean Bart cuttings. You're all traitors." The crowd around Chaval grew threatening, and fists were raised, and cries of "Kill him! Kill him!" began to be uttered. He had grown pale, but in his infuriated desire to triumph over Étienne, an idea restored him. "Listen to me, then. Come to morrow to Jean Bart, and you shall see if I'm working. We're on your side; they've sent me to tell you so. The fires must be extinguished, and the engine men, too, must go on strike. All the better if the pumps do stop. The water will destroy the pits and everything will be done for." He was furiously applauded in his turn, and now Étienne himself was outflanked. Other orators succeeded each other from the tree trunk, gesticulating amid the tumult, and throwing out wild propositions. It was a mad outburst of faith, the impatience of a religious sect which, tired of hoping for the expected miracle, had at last decided to provoke it. These heads, emptied by famine, saw everything red, and dreamed of fire and blood in the midst of a glorious apotheosis from which would arise universal happiness. And the tranquil moon bathed this surging sea, the deep forest encircled with its vast silence this cry of massacre. The frozen moss crackled beneath the heels of the crowd, while the beeches, erect in their strength, with a delicate tracery of their black branches against the white sky, neither saw nor heard the miserable beings who writhed at their feet. There was some pushing, and Maheude found herself near Maheu. Both of them, driven out of their ordinary good sense, and carried away by the slow exasperation which had been working within them for months, approved Levaque, who went to extremes by demanding the heads of the engineers. Pierron had disappeared. Bonnemort and Mouque were both talking together, saying vague violent things which nobody heard. For a joke, Zacharie demanded the demolition of the churches, while Mouquet, with his cross in his hand, was beating it against the ground for the sake of increasing the row. The women were furious. The Levaque, with her fists to her hips, was setting to with Philoméne, whom she accused of having laughed. Mouquette talked of attacking the gendarmes by kicking them somewhere. Mother Brulé, who had just slapped Lydie on finding her without either basket or salad, went on launching blows into space against all the masters whom she would like to have got at. For a moment Jeanlin was in terror, Bébert having learned through a trammer that Madame Rasseneur had seen them steal Poland. But when he had decided to go back and quietly release the beast at the door of the Avantage, he shouted louder than ever and opened his new knife, brandishing the blade and proud of its glitter. "Mates! Mates!" repeated the exhausted Étienne, hoarse with the effort to obtain a moment's silence for a definite understanding. At last they listened. "Mates, to morrow morning at Jean Bart. Is it agreed?" "Yes, yes, at Jean Bart. Death to the traitors!" The tempest of these 3,000 voices filled the sky, and died away in the pure brightness of the moon. Section 24 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part V. Chapter I. At 4 o'clock the moon had set, and the night was very dark. Everything was still asleep at Deneulin's. The old brick house stood mute and gloomy, with closed doors and windows, at the end of the large ill kept garden which separated it from the Jean Bart mine. The other frontage faced the deserted road to Vandame, a large country town, about 3 kilometres off, hidden behind the forest. Deneulin, tired after a day spent in park below, was snoring with his face toward the wall, when he dreamt that he had been called. At last he awoke, and really hearing a voice, got out and opened the window. One of his captains was in the garden. "What is it, then?" he asked. "There's a rebellion, sir. Half the men will not work, and are preventing the others from going down." He scarcely understood, with head heavy and dazed with sleep, and the great cold struck him like an icy douche. "Then make them go down, by George!" he stammered. "It's been going on an hour," said the captain. "Then we thought it best to come for you. Perhaps you will be able to persuade them." "Very good, I'll go." He quickly dressed himself, his mind quite clear now, and very anxious. The house might have been pillaged. Neither the cook nor the manservant had stirred, but from the other side of the staircase alarmed voices were whispering, and when he came out he saw his daughter's door open, and they both appeared in white dressing gowns, slipped on in haste. "Father, what is it?" Lucie, the elder, was already 22, a tall dark girl with a haughty air, while Jeanne, the younger, as yet scarcely 19 years old, was small, with golden hair and a certain caressing grace. "Nothing serious," he replied to reassure them. "It seems that some blusterers are making a disturbance down there. I am going to see." But they exclaimed that they would not let him go before he had taken something warm. If not, he would come back ill, with his stomach out of order, as he always did. He struggled, gave his word of honour that he was too much in a hurry. "Listen," said Jeanne at last, hanging to his neck. "You must drink a little glass of rum and eat 2 biscuits, or I shall remain like this, and you'll have to take me with you." He resigned himself, declaring that the biscuits would choke him. They had already gone down before him, each with her candlestick. In the dining room below they hastened to serve him, one pouring out the rum, the other running to the pantry for the biscuits. Having lost their mother when very young, they had been rather badly brought up alone, spoilt by their father, the elder haunted by the dream of singing on the stage, the younger mad over painting, in which she showed a singular boldness of taste. But when they had to retrench after the embarrassment in their affairs, these apparently extravagant girls had suddenly developed into very sensible and shrewd managers, with an eye for errors of centimes in accounts. Today, with their boyish and artistic demeanour, they kept the purse, were careful over sous, and haggled with the tradesmen, renovated their dresses unceasingly, and, in fact, succeeded in rendering decent the growing embarrassment of the house. "Eat, papa," repeated Lucie. Then, remarking his silent, gloomy preoccupation, she was again frightened. "Is it serious, then, that you look at us like this? Tell us; we will stay with you, and they can do without us at that lunch." She was speaking of a party which had been planned for the morning. Madame Hennebeau was to go in her carriage, first for Cécile at the Grégoires', then to call for them, so that they could all go to Martian's to lunch at the forges, where the manager's wife had invited them. It was an opportunity to visit the workshops, the blast furnaces, and the coke ovens. "We will certainly remain," declared Jeanne in her turn. But he grew angry. "A fine idea! I tell you that it is nothing. Just be so good as to get back into your beds again, and dress yourselves for 9 o'clock, as was arranged." He kissed them and hastened to leave. They heard the noise of his boots vanishing over the frozen earth in the garden. Jeanne carefully placed the stopper in the rum bottle, while Lucie locked up the biscuits. The room had the cold neatness of dining rooms, where the table is but meagrely supplied. And both of them took advantage of this early descent to see if anything had been left uncared for the evening before. A serviette lay about. The servant should be scolded. At last they were upstairs again. While he was taking the shortest cut through the narrow paths of his kitchen garden, Deneulin was thinking of his compromised fortune, this Montsou denier, this million which he had realized, dreaming to multiply it tenfold, and which was to day running such great risks. It was an uninterrupted course of ill luck, enormous and unforeseen repairs, ruinous conditions of exploitation, then the disaster of this industrial crisis, just when the profits were beginning to come in. If the strike broke out here, he would be overthrown. He pushed a little door. The buildings of the pit could be divined in the black night by the deepening of the shadow, starred by a few lanterns. Jean Bart was not so important as the Voreux, but its renewed installation made it a pretty pit, as the engineers say. They had not been contented by enlarging the shaft 1 metre and a half, and deepening it to 708 metres. They had equipped it afresh with a new engine, new cages, entirely new material, all set up according to the latest scientific improvements; and even a certain seeking for elegance was visible in the constructions: a screening shed with carved frieze, a steeple adorned with a clock, a receiving room and an engine room, both rounded into an apse like a Renaissance chapel, and surmounted by a chimney with a mosaic spiral made of black bricks and red bricks. The pump was placed on the other shaft of the concession, the old Gaston Marie pit, reserved solely for this purpose. Jean Bart, to right and left of the winding shaft, only had two conduits, that for the steam ventilator and that for the ladders. In the morning, ever since 3 o'clock, Chaval, who had arrived first, had been seducing his comrades, convincing them that they ought to imitate those at Montsou and demand an increase of 5 centimes a tram. Soon 400 workmen had passed from the shed into the receiving room, in the midst of a tumult of gesticulation and shouting. Those who wished to work stood with their lamps, barefooted, with shovel or pick beneath their arms, while the others, still in their sabots, with their overcoats on their shoulders because of the great cold, were barring the shaft. And the captains were growing hoarse in the effort to restore order, begging them to be reasonable and not to prevent those who wanted from going down. But Chaval was furious when he saw Catherine in her trousers and jacket, her head tied up in a blue cap. On getting up he had roughly told her to stay in bed. In despair at this arrest of work she had followed him all the same, for he never gave her any money. She often had to pay both for herself and him. And what was to become of her if she earned nothing? She was overcome by fear, the fear of a brothel at Martian's, which was the end of putter girls without bread and without lodging. "By God!" cried Chaval, "what the devil have you come here for?" She stammered that she had no income to live on, and that she wanted to work. "Then you put yourself against me, wench? Back you go at once, or I'll go back with you and kick my sabots into your backside." She recoiled timidly, but she did not leave, resolved to see how things would turn out. Deneulin had arrived by the screening stairs. In spite of the weak light of the lanterns, with a quick look he took in the scene, with this rabble wrapped in shadow. He knew every face: the pikemen, the porters, the landers, the putters, even the trammers. In the nave, still new and clean, the arrested task was waiting. The steam in the engine, under pressure, made slight whistling sounds. The cages were hanging motionless to the cables. The trams, abandoned on the way, were encumbering the metal floors. Scarcely 80 lamps had been taken. The others were flaming in the lamp cabin, but no doubt a word from him would suffice, and the whole life of labour would begin again. "Well, what's going on then, my lads?" he asked in a loud voice. "What are you angry about? Just explain to me and we will see if we can agree." He usually behaved in a paternal way towards his men, while at the same time demanding hard work. With an authoritative, rough manner, he had tried to conquer them by a good nature which had its outbursts of passion, and he often gained their love. The men especially respected in him his courage, always in the cuttings with them, the first in danger whenever an accident terrified the pit. Twice, after fire damp explosions, he had been let down, fastened by a rope under his armpits, when the bravest drew back. "Now," he began again, "you are not going to make me repent of having trusted you. You know that I have refused police protection. Talk quietly, and I will hear you." All were now silent and awkward, moving away from him, and it was Chaval who at last said: "Well, Monsieur Deneulin, we can't go on working. We must have 5 centimes more the tram." He seemed surprised. "What, 5 centimes? And why this demand? I don't complain about your timbering. I don't want to impose a new tariff on you like the Montsou directors, maybe. But the Montsou mates are right, all the same. They won't have the tariff, and they want a rise of 5 centimes because it is not possible to work properly at the present rates. We want 5 centimes more, don't we, you others?" Voices approved, and the noise began again in the midst of violent gesticulation. Gradually they grew near, forming a small circle. A flame came into Deneulin's eyes, and his fist, that of a man who likes strong government, was clenched, for fear of yielding to the temptation of seizing one of them by the neck. He preferred to discuss on the basis of reason. "You want 5 centimes, and I agree that the work is worth it. Only I can't give it. If I gave it, I should simply be done for. You must understand that I have to live first in order for you to live, and I've got to the end. The least rise in net prices will upset me. 2 years ago, you remember, at the time of the last strike, I yielded. I was able to then. But that rise of wages was not the less ruinous, for these 2 years have been a struggle. Today I would rather let the whole thing go than not be able to tell next month where to get the money to pay you." Chaval laughed roughly in the face of this master who told them his affairs so frankly. The others lowered their faces, obstinate and incredulous, refusing to take into their heads the idea that a master did not gain millions out of his men. Then Deneulin, persisting, explained his struggle with Montsou, always on the watch and ready to devour him, if, some day, he had the stupidity to come to grief. It was a savage competition which forced him to economize, the more so since the great depth of Jean Bart increased the price of extraction, an unfavourable condition hardly compensated by the great thickness of the coal beds. He would never have raised wages after the last strike if it had not been necessary for him to imitate Montsou, for fear of seeing his men leave him. And he threatened them with the morrow. A fine result it would be for them, if they obliged him to sell, to pass beneath the terrible yoke of the directors. He did not sit on a throne far away in an unknown sanctuary. He was not one of those shareholders who pay agents to skin the miner who has never seen them. He was a master. He risked something besides his money. He risked his intelligence, his health, his life. Stoppage of work would simply mean death, for he had no stock, and he must fulfil orders. Besides, his standing capital could not sleep. How could he keep his engagements? Who would pay the interest on the sums his friends had confided to him? It would mean bankruptcy. "That's where we are, my good fellows," he said in conclusion. "I want to convince you, we don't ask a man to cut his own throat, do we? And if I give you your 5 centimes, or if I let you go out on strike, it's the same as if I cut my throat." He was silent. Grunts went round. A party among the miners seemed to hesitate. Several went back towards the shaft. "At least," said a captain, "let every one be free. Who are those who want to work?" Catherine had advanced among the first, but Chaval fiercely pushed her back, shouting: "We are all agreed. It's only bloody rogues who'll leave their mates." After that conciliation appeared impossible. The cries began again, and men were hustled away from the shaft, at the risk of being crushed against the walls. For a moment the manager, in despair, tried to struggle alone, to reduce the crowd by violence, but it was useless madness, and he retired. For a few minutes he rested, out of breath, on a chair in the receiver's office, so overcome by his powerlessness that no ideas came to him. At last he grew calm, and told an inspector to go and bring Chaval. Then, when the latter had agreed to the interview, he motioned the others away. "Leave us." Deneulin's idea was to see what this fellow was after. At the first words he felt that he was vain and was devoured by passionate jealousy. Then he attacked him by flattery, affecting surprise that a workman of his merit should so compromise his future. It seemed as though he had long had his eyes on him for rapid advancement, and he ended by squarely offering to make him captain later on. Chaval listened in silence, with his fists at first clenched, but then gradually unbent. Something was working in the depths of his skull. If he persisted in the strike, he would be nothing more than Étienne's lieutenant, while now another ambition opened, that of passing into the ranks of the bosses. The heat of pride rose to his face and intoxicated him. Besides, the band of strikers whom he had expected since the morning had not arrived. Some obstacle must have stopped them, perhaps the police. It was time to submit. But all the time he shook his head. He acted the incorruptible man, striking his breast indignantly. Then, without mentioning to the master the rendezvous he had given to the Montsou men, he promised to calm his mates, and to persuade them to go down. Deneulin remained hidden, and the captains themselves stood aside. For an hour they heard Chaval orating and discussing, standing on a tram in the receiving room. Some of the men hooted him. 120 went off exasperated, persisting in the resolution which he had made them take. It was already past 7. The sun was rising brilliantly. It was a bright day of hard frost. And all at once movement began in the pit, and the arrested labour went on. First the crank of the engine plunged, rolling and unrolling the cables on the drums. Then, in the midst of the tumult of the signals, the descent took place. The cages filled and were engulfed, and rose again, the shaft swallowing its ration of trammers and putters and pikemen, while on the metal floors the landers pushed the trams with a sound of thunder. "By God! what the devil are you doing there?" cried Chaval to Catherine, who was awaiting her turn. "Will you just go down and not laze about?" At 9 o'clock, when Madame Hennebeau arrived in her carriage with Cécile, she found Lucie and Jean quite ready and very elegant, in spite of their dresses having been renovated for the 20th time. But Deneulin was surprised to see Négrel accompanying the carriage on horseback. What! Were the men also in the party? Then Madame Hennebeau explained in her maternal way that they had frightened her by saying that the streets were full of evil faces, and so she preferred to bring a defender. Négrel laughed and reassured them, nothing to cause anxiety, threats of brawlers as usual, but not one of them would dare to throw a stone at a window pane. Still, pleased with his success, Deneulin related the checked rebellion at Jean Bart. He said that he was now quite at rest, and on the Vandame road, while the young ladies got into the carriage, all congratulated themselves on the superb day, oblivious of the long swelling shudder of the marching people afar off in the country, though they might have heard the sound of it if they had pressed their ears against the earth. "Well, it is agreed," replied Madame Hennebeau. "This evening you will call for the ladies and dine with us. Madame Grégoire has also promised to come for Cécile." "You may reckon on me," replied Deneulin. The carriage went off towards Vandame, Jean and Lucie leaning down to laugh once more to their father, who was standing by the roadside. while Négrel gallantly trotted behind the fleeing wheels. They crossed the forest, taking the road from Vandame to Marchiennes. As they approached Tartaret, Jeanne asked Madame Hennebeau if she knew Côte Verte, and the latter, in spite of her stay of 5 years in the country, acknowledged that she had never been on that side. Then they made a detour. Tartaret, on the outskirts of the forest, was an uncultivated moor of volcanic sterility, under which for ages a coal mine had been burning. Its history was lost in legend. The miners of the place said that fire from heaven had fallen on this Sodom in the bowels of the earth, where the putter girls had committed abominations together, so that they had not even had the time to come to the surface, and today were still burning at the bottom of this hell. The calcined rocks, of a sombre red, were covered by an efflorescence of alum, as by a leprosy. Sulphur grew like a yellow flower at the edge of the fissures. At night those who were brave enough to venture to look into these holes declared that they saw flames there, sinful souls shrivelling in the furnace within. Wandering lights moved over the soil, and hot vapours, the poisons from the devil's ordure and his dirty kitchen, were constantly smoking. And like a miracle of eternal spring, in the midst of this accursed moor of Tartaret, Côte Verte appeared, with its meadows for ever green, its beeches with leaves unceasingly renewed, its fields where 3 harvests ripened. It was a natural hothouse, warmed by the fire in the deep strata beneath. The snow never lay on it. The enormous bouquet of verdure beside the leafless forest trees blossomed on this December day, and the frost had not even scorched the edge of it. Soon the carriage was passing over the plain. Négrel joked over the legend, and explained that a fire often occurred at the bottom of a mine, from the fermentation of the coal dust. If not mastered, it would burn on for ever. And he mentioned a Belgian pit which had been flooded by diverting a river and running it into the pit. But he became silent. For the last few minutes groups of miners had been constantly passing the carriage. They went by in silence, with sidelong looks at the luxurious equipage, which forced them to stand aside. Their number went on increasing. The horses were obliged to cross the little bridge over the Scarpe at walking pace. What was going on, then, to bring all these people into the roads? The young ladies became frightened, and Négrel began to smell out some fray in the excited country. It was a relief when they at last arrived at Marchiennes. The batteries of coke ovens and the chimneys of the blast furnaces, beneath a sun which seemed to extinguish them, were belching out smoke and raining their everlasting soot through the air. Section 25